Previously on A Brief History of the Minimoog. Now, where were we? Oh yes, right around 1980, when all this happened. What was going on in the music industry was equally innovative. An entire generation was witnessing a shift from the guitar-driven rock and roll of the previous decade to a mainstream acceptance of synthesized pop. Devo, a band that Kurt Cobain of Nirvana would one day call the most challenging and subversive of all, had been using a Model D Minimoog synthesizer from the very start. It was one of the key elements on their first album, Are We Not Men, We Are Devo, where it was featured on their classic track Jocko Homo, produced by another Minimoog champion, Brian Eno. But Devo weren't alone in their use of the Minimoog. The London-based scene, known as the New Romantics, were using the discarded synthesizers from the prog generation to form their vision of the future. Ultravox, a band that had formed in the previous decade with synthesist John Fox at the helm, had reinvented themselves from post-punk curiosities to chart-topping synth-pop heroes.
And this is the actual synth that we did, the sort of Vienna part on the bass part, the you know.
Alone in the night as the daylight brings a cool empty silence.
But all this activity in the rock world hadn't gone unnoticed by musicians from other arenas. Jazz legend Herbie Hancock, who had long been a Minimoog player, now used the synthesizer as part of his biggest hit ever, Rocket. And Larry Dunn, a young keyboard player who had joined Earth, Wind & Fire as a teenager in the early 70s, made the original Minimoog a key feature of their platinum R&B sound. But there was no album in all of pop history that relied on the Minimoog to color its sound more than the most successful record in the history of recorded sound, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Michael Boddicker, a principal keyboard player in Quincy Jones's stable of elite studio musicians, used two modified Minimoogs to propel the bass lines for several of the album's signature tracks. Another musician who played a part of Thriller's epic rise to the all-time best-selling album position was Steve Porcaro, who as a member of Toto used his Minimoog during one of the best-known songs of the decade, Rosanna.
We'll be dealing with the Minimoog here, which it seems no matter what new comes out, I always gravitate back towards it. There's something about the dirtiness of the filter and that old analog rub that I still love and still like to hear.
Inspired by Bernie Worrell's pioneering use of the Minimoog Model D, first heard on the albums of Parliament Funkadelic, a teenage Andre Young, aka Dr. Dre, was drawn to the rich and pure sounds of the analog synthesizer. Dr. Dre conjured Worrell's foundational funk by utilizing the Minimoog Model D as a central component of the West Coast hip-hop sound, which was firmly established in the landmark releases The Chronic and Doggy Style. A similar insurgence was also being seen in the rock world, where industrial musician Trent Reznor used an old Model D he had come across during the early part of his career for Nine Inch Nails' debut album, Pretty Hate Machine.
Any synth bass that's ever been on Pretty Hate Machine was Minimoog, you know, and it was just light years beyond anything else I had. You know, the emotional connection that always came out of the Minimoog, just touching the key. And this was doing battle with tune drifting and the clumsy MIDI implementation and envelopes that I wish behaved a little bit differently, but the sound itself was unmatched then and remains that way.
By the end of the decade, the pop world was primed for another shift. Hair metal and boy bands had come to rule the day, and electronic music was forced back into the underground, particularly in Detroit, the home of house and techno.
I went to a local college here. They had an original Moog, a D, and that's how I learned how to program. The instructor was very adamant about how he could recreate anything. He could recreate wind sounds, he could recreate brass sounds, he could recreate string sounds, whatever with this D.
Back in the UK, the house music that filtered over from Chicago and Detroit took root in acid house and the rave culture that gave rise to bands like 808 State. By the mid-90s, experimental bands in the UK like Portishead had also adopted a love of vintage Minimoogs and used them to craft a hybrid, psychedelic, gritty sound that would come to be known as trip-hop.
This is my old Mini that I used to have two, but this one's an early one, and it's really lovely. Signed by Robert Moog as well.
The original Minimoog had found a place in the music world no matter what shape it took from year to year. It had become a true classic. A cosmic machine sent from tomorrow, its analog circuits resonate at frequencies that compel the human mind to connect to that non-physical reality from which the universe and everything in it flows. The Minimoog Model D, a never-ending source of the sounds of the future.